I'd love to take a little bit of moderator prerogative to ask a couple of questions, and it's not one question for both of you. I'm not Tony. I'm not that fast. So, uh, so I want to think a little bit about complicity. I'm going to start with complicity because we ended up with the last panel on resistance, and to me, resistance and complicity have a very particular relationship. And so, Will, when you were talking about complicity, you're moving from what you called 21st century complicity and going back to mid 20th century Europe and the US. So, as someone who was raised in a late 20th century moment of thinking about complicity in relationship to resistance, and probably thinking about it in relationship to the post-colonial or seemingly non-colonial or formally colonized world, and how the realities of many of those countries in the 80s and 90s in relationship to capitalism tried to imagine resistance and complicity as a dyad. I guess what I want to know is, what's the place of late 20th century complicity in your work, or does it fall out of your historical analysis, and why? So, and I guess I'm thinking about that a little bit because in talking about guilt, right, I would think with Diana Taylor, thinking about dictatorships in the Southern Cone, thinking about percepticide actually is a different version of not seeing the state's violence as it takes people out of their homes next door to you, right? So I think there's a connection there. So I would love to hear that historical piece, maybe. And then I guess, you know, Emily, what's interesting about using the word plot, I was thinking, like, what would be the synonyms? Like, why plot versus implotment, or why plot versus narrative? So what does plot, on a formal level, what does plot do for you that narrative doesn't? And I think what the relationship between your work on the Cambodian genocide does in relationship with our current genocide in Gaza, in Palestine, is that it seems like it sutures together the idea that the plot of genocide is also the plot of empire. I mean, it could be the plot of colonialism, but it feels a little bit more like it's the plot of empire in your work. So I wonder if you could speak to that. And after that, I'm just going to watch hands and try to go in the proper order. So thank you.
Thank you. First of all, could you tell me a bit more what you mean by that relationship between complicity and resistance?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, we've talked about Scott today, so I have to bring up complicity and resistance together. So I think that in a sort of a late 90s moment, maybe, the idea is that there's a relationship between complicity and resistance, and people would articulate political action or lack of action as being on one side or another. Is someone being complicit or being resistant? Does that make sense? And thinking about Scott with Weapons of the Week, right? Those are the small kind of everyday pieces that we talked about in the last panel about resistance versus complicity, maybe with a colonial government or an empire, right? So it seems like, I think there's a historical piece of time, for lack of a better word, that you're moving around, and I'm wondering why, or what that would mean, right?
Okay. Well, I suppose the first thing I would say is that I tend to think about complicity discourse in terms of its prominence in public media, in mainstream media. So my examples were taken not from recent critics or scholars that have written about complicity, but from New York Times articles or articles in The Atlantic to give some sense of the way it's being used in a more mainstream sense outside the academy. And it seems to me that the prominence of complicity discourse rises and falls. It's a kind of stream that sometimes is visible above the surface and is sometimes more subterranean. And my kind of tentative hypothesis is that it raised above the surface after World War II and crystallized in the 1960s into a very identifiable way of talking about politics. to the extent that it became understood as a cliche and was satirized, widely satirized and discussed then. And then it seems to me that the stream continues, but is less visible until the 21st century moment when it erupts again in my kind of version of this history with the Trump presidency. But that's not to say that it's not tremendously important for scholars at various points in the intervening years. So that would be one kind of response. But the other one would be to say, given the examples you bring up about the Southern Cone, be to really think about US neo-colonial practices in that intervening period in the later part of the 20th century, and the way that those neo-colonial practices allowed the US administrations of Reagan in particular to preserve a kind of innocence in the way they projected themselves to their own base and to American citizens. So I'm interested in my research. I'm interested in Joan Didion's book on Salvador as quite an interesting example of that kind of complicity moment, where she is faced with seeing things that she wishes she hadn't seen, and continues to narrate them, knowing that she shouldn't be narrating them, and is caught up in some kind of complicit impasse in her writing, which plays out in her style and in her form. So I think, yeah, US neo-colonial practice in the 80s and 90s is definitely part of that story. And I don't see it as necessarily different in kind from the 21st century versions that we've been discussing here, just simply given the continuities in US neo-colonial practice during that period.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patty. I always appreciate your readings of my work. So yeah, what does plot do that narrative doesn't? I think on the immediate level, like there is this question of conspiracy, and I wanted to share this definition of conspiracy that one of my friends recently shared with me, which is from the European Commission, which says the belief that certain events or situations are secretly manipulated behind the scenes by powerful forces with negative intent. So this definition holds a question of belief, but it doesn't say whether that is really the case, that there is something happening behind the scenes by powerful forces with negative intent. It holds it at the question of like individuated paranoia, right? And so much of the history that I study is often cast as a question of conspiracy when it is both a question of conspiracy as well as the actual like state infrastructures that support the kinds of knowledges that I and many other people then find ourselves within, as a question of area studies, for instance. Why that I think works better than narrative is that with narrative, which I also find very important, there's often a question of de facto narration. Like what is the way that can history be told without narrative? Is it something that should be not narrated or not put in a certain order of things? And is that even possible? That's kind of White's question, and something that he works through variously with different takes on it at different times. But I think it's more important in the sense of plot to think about and really hold centrally the question of the power structures within which that is produced. And I think plot does something of that. And yeah, on the question of plot of genocide versus plot of empire, or holding those things together, I think there's something important about even thinking about the terms of genocide as part of, right, like this is where I think our papers did have a conversation in the end, about thinking about the plot has a history, genocide itself as a term has a history. Like thinking about Raphael Lemkin's consolidation and the way that has played out to really limit, not only in the legal sense, but in broader senses, the way that term can be understood to apply to third world racialized peoples or not. Like, and in the legal form, in its retroactive application is absolutely disallowed, right? But even there, I think, you know, we were talking a bit about weapons of the weak, and I think that this doesn't at all kind of preclude the important usage of the terms like genocide, from like we charge genocide, for instance, and its contemporary usage in respect to Palestine, which I fully agree with. But what does that history do for how these terms move through our lives and through the kinds of speech and action that become possible? Like, what do we do with the concept of weapons of the weak as it emerges from James Scott's work in the wake of his CIA service and his turning over of Indonesian students' names to the CIA in right before the 1965 genocide, right? It's present. It's part of plot. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think I have Bonnie, Jacques, Lowry, then Brian. Yeah, Bonnie.
I'll just say again, those were great. Thank you both. I have a question for, sorry, I can't quite figure out. Okay. I have a question for Will, and it's kind of a very theory question about Arendt. I just want to think with you a little bit about what you were saying about Arendt, partly to be more critical and partly maybe to be a little less critical. I'm not sure. Doesn't really matter. I'm trying to figure out, it seemed to me that everything that you appreciated in her work, which I thought you gave a great rendering of in terms of the problem of individual guilt and moralism and politics and the rest, you then find in more or less, it sounded to me, correct me if I'm wrong, in Sartre also. But in Sartre, it's coupled with this decolonial politics that is lacking in her, supposedly. So I just really wanted to ask you about that. I wanted to ask so I'm trying to figure out why you're spending time with her at all, if it's all in Sartre. That's sort of the short version of the question. And I say that as an Arendt scholar. So what I'm trying to figure out is what would, implicit in that is that she would have given a different account either of politics or moralism, of conscience or collectivism, had she attended to the things that she leaves out. In other words, the problem wouldn't be a conceptual problem, it would just be a contingent problem. She was wrong on some political issues. The implication of the claim, or my inference from it, is that there would have been maybe either an account slightly more different from Sartre's or more different from her own had she not erred on these particular cases. Had she taken into account white supremacy, had she seen the US as an empire, etc., would that just make her more like Sartre? Or the question for me is, how might it have changed what she saw as the problematic and her theoretical conceptualization of it? And the reason I'm asking is that I'm not sure. The reason I'm asking is I'm interested in your answer, but genuinely, but I'm also just thinking that I don't know how correct that is, actually. I think she's wrong about those things, but she's wrong about them not in the sense that she didn't pay attention to white supremacy. She thought the rule of law could meet the challenge it posed. Like, she was wrong about white supremacy. Maybe she was, but I don't think she was inattentive to the racism of the United States. She was wrong about what the right measures might be. She was still a liberal in some ways. Not that that's a terrible thing to be. And then but sometimes it is. So, and then she saw, and then she saw, so here's the other thing that's kind of missing for me from the account of Arendt, and it may be, elsewhere in your work, that she saw the importance of the imperial forces and great powers in operation in the Middle East, and the US was definitely part of the picture of what she thought was going to happen as a result of how Israel's founding was being managed through the great powers and how it was becoming a pawn in the great game, as she described it, the 20th century version of the 19th century game. And there she saw Europe and the US, not just Europe and not the US as imperial, but both of them as converging in the 20th century edition of the original 19th century game. And that was also true in the way that she saw Vietnam. And so, so I don't mean that as a correction, who cares, but I just mean that you're saying that what's good about her sounds the same as what we have from Sartre, so why bother with her is my question. And I think the reason might be that some of it isn't as cleanly divided as I think you were suggesting, but I wait to hear. And if so, is there something that we can learn from the missteps and the mistakes rather than the she didn't help us here, she doesn't talk about this? You know what I mean? Like the ways in which she herself is negotiating a difficulty that she kind of enters herself into, but isn't blind to white supremacy and American imperialism, is somehow complicit. I don't know. So I don't know. That's...
Okay. Well, I hate to disappoint you, but I think your question might have been more interesting than my answer.
I'm sure that's not true.
My interest in Arendt is something like a kind of case study. I think she makes an interesting comparative case study with Sartre. She's reading Sartre at exactly the moment when she formulates those ideas in Origins of Totalitarianism. She has her own conceptual language, which is a little bit different from Sartre's, particularly the language around guilt and responsibility. Which we might take something from which is not available to us through Sartre's much more kind of recondite language in being and nothingness. If people want to wade through that, they might do better to start with Arendt on guilt and responsibility in the late 40s. I do think she's blind about American imperialism. Certainly in the 40s and 50s she is. I think that position changes later, as you've already explained for us. But in Origins of Totalitarianism, she makes a very questionable statement that the United States is simply not part of that history of empire that she describes in that book. She suggests that their racist problems are domestic problems and can only be understood in domestic terms, which I just think is plain wrong, really demonstrably wrong. So in that sense, I do think she has a blindness which I can explain only not in intellectual terms, but in terms of her biography and her desire for success as an American intellectual during the era of McCarthyism. But others will have their own interpretation of that. But that's mine. I think one of the interesting elements that comes out of a comparison between Arendt and Sartre in this period is Sartre's willingness to deal with self-implication at the level of style in his situations essays. So he is happy to evoke affects of shame and anger in his work that Arendt simply isn't. And for some people that will make Sartre's work richer, and for some it will make Arendt's work richer. Reading Arendt across the years during this period, there are moments when she plays with the possibility of self-implication, when she discusses her response as an intellectual to National Socialism in the 30s, when she prefaces her essay on Little Rock with her discussion of being a European Jew, and therefore for that reason her sympathy with Black Americans should be taken as read, but that she has never gone to the South because it would be too unbearable for her. Those are little moments of discomfort when Arendt seems that she's verging on addressing complicity as a problem at the level of literary form, but then she pulls back. In Sartre, you get it, you get the full treatment. And so as a literary scholar, I'm kind of interested in the way they both use the form of the essay. But that doesn't really answer your question about like, why do we need Arendt and not Sartre? I guess I'm not really approaching it from that perspective. I think we can see things about the other by reading them comparatively. So I guess my approach is maybe prioritizing something a bit different.
Thank you both. A comment for you to converse if possible, and then a question more specifically for Will, I think, although perhaps again for both. I was struck that in both the device of the after effect of Nachträglichkeit is at work. Plotting is always a procedure of secondary revision. It's something that you add after a sequencing of events. At least on Freud's description of secondary processes. The king died, the queen died of grief, Forster, on the way that the addition of causation is the differential between simply a sequencing of events and the emergence of plot. The of grief.
The predictive, the plan.
And the plan, well, but the plan is disclosed after the fact. You say, oh, the bomb exploded. There was a plot that produced the bomb. Otherwise, it's an event, and don't you think? I mean, okay.
Except for the plotter, but sorry. Please continue.
No. I want to hear. So simply to have the conversation between you two about the place of Nachträglichkeit and après coup effects, if you want to. It's an invitation, not an order. Do it now. Now. Okay. The other thing was for Will. Does complicity require, as genocide does for the International Court of Justice and for legislation in general, does it require mens rea? Does it require the intentional conception of the outcome? That's the sticking point in the ICJ's deliberations very often. The critiques of the use of genocide come from saying, well, nobody is intending, no one has the explicit intent or the conceptualization in advance of the outcome, the mens rea, and that means that you can't really judge that to be genocidal. So is complicity always structurally après coup? You describe, you figure out that you were complicit, or is there a necessary conceptualizing of the outcome that juridically seems to be required for the mens rea requirement?
Do you want to go first and respond to the comment, or? Okay, I'll dive in. So from a legal perspective, there's I think a quite clear answer to your question, which is that according to the convention, the complicit party does not need to have knowledge of the genocidal intentions of the perpetrator. They simply have to have knowledge that they're enabling a wrong action, as I understand it. Go on.
Okay, but you do have to know that you're enabling something that is adjudged to be a wrong action.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to know that it's a wrong action. You don't have to know that there's a genocidal intent.
Got it.
That's as I understand it, that's what the ICJ tells us. But in terms of the much more nebulous ways that complicity is figured as a problem, kind of liberal problem for the moral conscience, I think one of the things that's made it so seductive as a discourse is precisely that one intends and doesn't intend simultaneously. And it's that drama which makes it so attractive to writers, both in fiction and in non-fiction throughout that whole period. The possibilities for exploring the nuances of consciousness, whether there's simultaneously two levels of conscience operating in relation to one another, or whether there's an oscillation between knowing and then not knowing and then knowing again. These are questions that Sartre has answers to, but writers, frankly, I don't want to be flippant about it, but writers have a lot of fun with it in the post-war period, and there are opportunities to use various kind of innovations of modernist form to give expression to these problems. So I think it's crucial for the seductiveness of the concept, I should say the seductiveness of the discourse, that the question of intention is in play but not settled.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Not to answer your question, but to ask a separate question. Do I understand your question was about the temporality, partially? Of
Well,
plot?
partially, yeah.
Okay, I'll come back to it. My question for you, though, kind of just thinking as you were speaking, I was really struck and persuaded by this formation of complicity as part of power's modality of implicating the totality of a population, of a community. And you named it specifically as terror, which I think sounds very right to me, as this performative relationship that's enacted through this implication and bringing in, folding in, as you're saying. And I feel like part of the thing that I was thinking about with plot is perhaps aligned with Professor Boggs' work, what is the doubling of it potentially? But in the case of your work, I was thinking about what is the Fanonian implication that occurs through violence, within a group, right? The collective work of doing violence, which then removes one from the possibility of recuperation by power, by the state. And that is also a performative relationship directed not only at one's compatriots, but the state itself, that you are bought in, right? You're not redeemable. And yeah, I guess I was wondering, in the implication that is happening in the perhaps the other side of that formulation in your work with complicity, how do you think about implicated to whom? I have a sense that it's on this moral internal question, but yeah, I was wondering about that.
Implicated to whom? Sorry, tell me a bit more about what you mean.
If you're implicated to, I don't want to take up too much time, but who is the performance directed at? What is the authorizing function? What makes it?
I think if I understand you correctly, the performance is directed at the self, and that's the source of its power and its danger.
That's what I was wondering
progressive
about.
Politics, I think. But just since you raised it on the question of Fanon, and one of the things I would have liked to talk about with more time today is the way that the anti-colonial struggles of the post-war period, together with the ongoing Marxist and communist traditions in that period, are what allows complicity to be seen as such. Bring it out into the open as a thing to be named. And Fanon's importance for Sartre is something along those lines, I think. So Fanon, I don't think, is particularly interested in complicity, but he makes Sartre interested in complicity because of his stance on violence. And I think some of the thinkers of the Black Power movement perform a similar function for American intellectuals in the 60s. Figures like Stokely Carmichael. They are not particularly interested in complicity themselves, as an object worthy of or necessitating discussion, but they prompt liberals to think about complicity in a way they hadn't been able to see before. So there's a kind of dialectic there, I think, which enables us to even speak about complicity really as a thing.
So-
is to the point, question to the question?
Yeah, so I think Brian and Susan have a question to the question, is that right?
No, mine is.
Okay, so I'm gonna go with Susan, and I'm gonna come to you, Brian. I know, Larry, you're also in the queue, so I'm gonna try to do this and then come back, okay?
So very quickly, if we put this into the current moment, one of the problems of those who don't want to be complicit with Trump is that he won the election. And the very fact that he challenged the election last time means we can't do that. We have to, as Democrats, somehow acknowledge that he won. I think this is people's feelings. It makes everyone complicit. And I just wondered what your thought was about not the historical examples that you've used, but the contemporary one, and then specifically when you spoke about the contemporary actions, the people who quit because of Gaza from the State Department. That was your example, yes? It was your example, I'm sorry. So that's, again, is this notion of quitting, this is my question, a non-complicitous act? Or is it always the individual who is trying to be morally pure?
So the simple answer to that is that they think it is, yes, but I'm suggesting that the whole frame of complicity discourse is not helpful.
Yeah, I know, but how can you get out of it is my question. Because there's a way that democracy, you see, produces the effect of having us either be uncomplicit with democracy or uncomplicit with the results of the election.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a convincing answer to that question of how practically we can decide to be not complicit. I think it requires something like what Sartre would call a conversion, like a radical shift in one's foundational sense of self and responsibility in the world. And it's extremely difficult because we live, and well, most of us, I won't speak for others, but many of us have lived and breathed the air that we have in the last 20 or 30 years. So to suddenly undertake that process of conversion and to think about guilt and responsibility in a completely new way is just really, really hard. But I don't have practical prescriptions for how to do it. That's beyond my competence, I'm afraid.
Okay, we have 14 minutes and 4 questions. So can I do Brian, Lowry, Wendy, then Tim? Can we hold 4 questions or comments together? I hope we can. Okay.
My questions for Willen sort of comes out of this, but the question of, I'm not hearing, I'm sure you're thinking about it, a sort of meta critique of complicity that would include the fact that whenever we take a Ford Foundation grant, or whether we're at Brown with Brown's endowment and all of its implications, we're always every day complicit, right? So we need to begin with perhaps a theory of levels of complicity which can be avoided and those which may be unavoidable, right? Where does Ford's money come from? Where does Brown's money come from? Or wherever we come from. And therefore, what is it that we think is desirable not to be complicit about? And to decide on, in a particular time and place, where those limits lie. I was thinking last year, just to be very quick, I know there are lots of people wanting to speak, but during the Gaza encampments here at Brown, I wanted to carry my students around to the encampment to have a class, because I thought if we sat on the steps by the college green at Brown, we could talk more directly about what was taking place with students who are not directly involved in it, but who could observe it. My students, perhaps wisely, felt that, no, it wasn't a good idea. Right? And so they guided me into not going on the steps and having my class. Subsequently, I discovered that the university had ruled having classes on the steps were illegal.
That's right.
And were verboten, right? So the point I'm making here, though, is that I still lose sleep over my complicity in not having done something beyond signing the inevitable documents which we did, or going to a meeting here and there. Am I sort of criminally complicit, or am I a step below being criminally complicit? And therefore, what are the boundaries of complicity that we're talking about? And then how do we look at that in a wider arc of always being complicit in the academy? Because, I mean, unless we're in a public academy, a public school which takes no grants from anyone who is involved in extraction of any kind, now or historically, which doesn't exist. So those are
Thank
my
you, Brian.
questions.
Larry?
Thank you. These were, am I? Oh, great. Sorry. Terrific papers. I have a very small thought for Will, and then I have a question for Emily, and I'll try to be quick. So the small thought is actually, I was thinking as you were describing the way King picks up Thoreau, that it would be interesting to move forward to King of A Time to Break Silence, and where do we go from here, where you do in fact have an anti-imperial account that is informed by Black power thinkers and activists, among other things, but it struck me that you know, he's invoking a kind of shared responsibility, the we are strange liberators, but it's also moving away from complicity as a liberal structure of feeling, I think, in the way that you describe. Emily, there was
100% agree.
there was so much in the paper that I just loved, but I wanted to hear more. It's not about and. I wanted to hear more about the relationship between the plot and plotting. So whether that's, you know, rebelling, running away, resisting, or growing and cultivating. And I was thinking, especially, I just taught Harriet Jacobs, who repurposes so many conventional narrative techniques, including appealing to the complicity of her white Northern liberal female readers, and yet does it to radically, to tell a story about plotting. And so I wanted to ask you just to sit a little bit with the relationship between the plot and plotting, and that's it. Thanks.
Wendy?
Hi, thanks to you both. I have a question for both of you, and then one that's more specifically for Emily. And I noticed that in both your papers, voice came up. Will, you were saying that silence is complicity, and your voice matters. And for Emily, it was the director Jaffe saying that there is a voice for Cambodia, and you are that voice. So I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit more about the role of voice in complicity and voice in the plot, because I think both seem to be, in these examples, what Will was describing as an appeal to moral obligation, or a hailing of a moral obligation, particularly, and you have to play this role because you are the voice for, I think, implicitly the voiceless. So for Emily, so what is the role of voice with the plot and with complicity? And for Emily, I was thinking particularly about voice and narrative, and that in thinking about narrative fiction, voice is usually thought of as the narrator who speaks in terms of narration. But with the film, the director is directing someone else to use their voice in a way that's different, like they're a character or something. So yeah, so I just want to hear more, both of you maybe say a little bit about voice in plotting and complicity.
Thank you. And Tim?
Thanks. It's a question for Will. You spoke, Will, very interestingly about, but also maybe evasively, about complicity as tremendously productive terrain to inhabit for a literary scholar. You had a certain amount of excitement there, and you spoke, I think, in a way, in a more ironic vein towards the end about writers having a lot of fun with complicity. So my question then is, comes actually out of something that Emily said to you, a lovely formulation, power's modality of co-implicating the majority. What do you do as a literary scholar with literature's modality of co-implicating the reader, co-implicating the character? I mean, this is the power of literature. What do you do? I mean, how do you square your commitment, your interest in literature, literary questions, literary complications, with the with the situation of, let's say, radical, urgency with which we need to make hard and fast political decisions around complicity. And we could extend that to a number of other things. We could just extend that to the conversation on climate change. But so how do you square your commitment to complicating in an aesthetic way questions of complicity, implication with the political challenges of our moment?
Great, so we have 6 minutes, so each of you can solve everything, 3 minutes each. Do you want to start, Emily, then we'll go to Will?
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your lovely comments and questions. Maybe Wendy, just briefly on the question of voice, I feel like the second part of your question maybe answered the first part in terms of, within that passage that you point to specifically, it is something about the funneling of voice into what might be the plot, the plotting. So yeah, but we'll talk more. And then Lori, I think it's kind of the stylistic gambit to think through the question of plot in the way that Saadia Hartman proposes, like the plot as the imperial genocidal capitalist formation, as I was thinking about a bit earlier, like the question of plotting as something that might also come from below. Is that kind of at the heart of what you're saying?
Yeah, and even thinking about Hartman of scenes of subjection, there are all kinds of examples that you might call plotting. Even in the to the end of redress, or to refusing to be fully embody and perform that enslaved subjectivity that they were expected to perform. Sorry,
Not at all. I don't want to take up all the time, but I take that seriously. I think there is something important about thinking about the plot of domination, and so counterplots, the temporality of plotting, perhaps. We should also talk more. Is not the stance I'm attempting to take here, but I think that I'll stop there. But let's talk more, please.
I think you should feel free to go on. Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think I had 2 questions directed to me. That the first one was yours about institutional complicity, which I think we start thinking about endowments, or you can think in similar terms about whatever institutions we're affiliated to. They're kind of foundational and unavoidable. And there are other scholars available who will do that kind of work that you described, of parsing the particular different forms of complicity and different levels of complicity, and making those finer distinctions and judgments. I don't know if anyone in the room has read Michael Rothberg's work, The Implicated Subject. He does this very well. So what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to do is something a little bit different. And my suggestion really is that complicity discourse needs to be transcended in some way. And this is partly an answer to your question, Tim, as well. I mean it when I say that I think it's a drain on our energies and resources as people with political commitments in the world. That's the conclusion that I've come to. So if you stay awake at night worrying about complicity, I'm sorry to hear that. And I imagine that if you had got a better night's sleep, you would be able to pursue your political commitments better in the morning. Another way of putting this is to say that, and this is maybe one of the uses of Arendt's terminology, that complicity asks us to take on guilt and frees us from responsibility. And what I think the direction of travel for us needs to be is exactly the opposite. Think about our responsibilities without the guilt. But we're at the level of psychology here, individual psychology, which is very personal, and I'm not an expert on that. And different people will experience these problems in different ways, and it depends on their backgrounds and their formations, and elements of their personal lives that I can't speak to. But I am sure that is the goal. So in that sense, while I admire Michael Rothberg's work and I learned very much from his book, that's not what I'm trying to do. It's not what I want to do. I don't want to make those finer distinctions. I think that, for me, would be a drain on my resources, if you like. What I'm interested in is a larger, you called it a metacritical argument about there being a problem with complicity as a discourse, which has, with the kind of historical perspective I put on it, has been disabling rather than enabling. Yeah. And then, Tim, I guess that was partly directed to you, as an answer to your question too. What I've come to realize in my own moment of Nachtraglichkeit, reading and writing this book on complicity, is that my own formation has been dedicated to parsing questions of complexity that are very closely related to complicity. And obviously they share a root, an etymological root. And the more I've read and thought, the more I understood that the formation of our discipline has been largely indebted to questions of self-implication and parsing self-implication. And I'm part of that story. I'm not interested in trying to change it in the past, but I'm potentially interested in trying to change it in the future. So I suppose I would say that, how do I square my political commitments to my literary ones? I'm still figuring that out. It's the honest answer.
Thank you all so much for two really beautiful papers, I think, about cultural production. And Emily is always pointing us to the material realities of the theory and the theorists that we inhabit or use in trying to do the political work. And I think my inarticulate question, Will, I think what you answered at the end was, I think that you're thinking about complicity maybe not in a dyad with resistance in quite the same way that in the first panel, and I think that's really interesting. So I think there's a break for an hour and 44 minutes or so, and we hope to see you back at 3 o'clock. Thank you.